Okay, I moved the goalpost a little bit. I actually have a master spreadsheet. We're on track for early next year wrapping it up, so it's not out of sight. But we're in Matthew 13. And I share some of this. We're going to take, and you're going to see me do this, larger clumps of verses. I'm trying to balance not flying through it so fast that you don't get the book of Matthew, and not going so slow that Lydia literally is driving by the time we get through. Let's see. So, as we come into Matthew 13, I know it's been 2 weeks since we were here. We're going to be looking at Jesus' parables. And this is going to be, in some ways, the anticlimactic message. It talks about the quiet, slow stuff. And let me put it this way. My first 2 mission trips that I went on, I was 16 when I went on my first mission trip. I didn't raise many missionary support. I hardly actually told many people that I was going. I just showed up, wrote a check, and went on a mission trip. And so how'd that happen? You know, if you know me, it's not because my family was wealthy and was bankrolling it. Every penny in that checking account was earned by me. But from the time I was little, my dad always tried to line up jobs for us. I'm not sure how young I was when I landed my first job, but probably around the age of 8 or less, I made my first $20, and Dad sat me down with my $20 and said, "So, how much of this are we going to give to church? How much do you want to put in your savings? And how much do you want to keep to spend?" And helped me learn to think through that process. And as it turned out, I liked saving. I think, if I remember correctly, my question was, how much money does Laura have in savings? There was a number to beat. So I spent money. I bought Legos, but I saved a lot of money. And so at 16, I could write a check for an entire mission trip out of that savings account because of 1,000 of those little moments, from lawn mowing to making boxes for a warehouse after hours to the first regular job that I'd had that summer. I'd saved. And none of those were big lumps. It was lots of little lumps over time that accumulated to being able to fund 2 entire mission trips without really even being too concerned about the dent it would make. It wasn't a big lump. It was just quiet consistency over time. And what I think we're seeing in today's passage is God's kingdom sometimes works that way. It's not a flashy thing to preach on. We'd like a one-off revival meeting. We like the big lump. But if you miss this side of the Christian life, I think you actually end up over time missing a lot. And so I'm calling today's message the subtle strategy of the kingdom in waiting. There's a waiting that God has ordained. It's part of his plan, and it allows for stuff to happen over time. And so here's the big picture from our passage, and I'll read the passage and see if you can see where I'm going. God delays his judgment. He delays his judgment to graciously give us time to come to Jesus and to reach the world for him. All right, so here's Matthew 13, jumping in at verse 24, reading down through 43. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to the master, 'Did you not sow good seed in your field? How then is there weeds?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' He said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first, bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.' He put another parable to them, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.' He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. So that's our parables. We got 3 of them sort of bundled together. First off, just as an aside, as we go through the Gospel of Matthew, we said there's going to be 2 things we're tracking. On the one hand, we're going to see the gospel of the kingdom, Jesus is king, and how that fits together. And along the way, we're going to see how the king builds his kingdom, how he makes disciples. And we've got both going on here. Notice he preaches in parables to the crowds, and then it says he pulled aside, and his disciples ask him, Lord, what does the parable mean? This is actually one of the most repeated things we see Jesus doing in the Gospel of Matthew, is this pull aside and extra explanation to the disciples. They're allowed to ask questions. Sometimes they get in trouble for the questions, but most of the time, he just answers. They get a unique level of access and explanation. And this is part of how Jesus disciples. So when we're talking about looking at Jesus as a role model for discipleship, understand if you're going to invest in people, if you're going to make disciples that follow Jesus, you have to make a relational commitment to them to be available and to be accessible. This one probably hits me as a pastor more profoundly because our expectations of pastors are all these different roles, right? Get up and preach, and there's a sense in which it would be easier, and there are plenty of big-name pastors who roll this way, to say, I'm a teaching pastor. So I will hide in my study. I can spend 30 hours crafting a great sermon, which I assure you I did not do. And then we'll have other people to be accessible. Jesus preaches great sermons, but he's also accessible. See, it's always tempting to choose something, professionalism instead of relationship. Jesus still preaches, Jesus still does formal ministry, but he also can sit down with some people and explain stuff and chat and talk. You need to make a decision. If God's laid somebody on your heart, how do you make yourself accessible to them? Where do you make space for that? Where do you make time for that? Jesus does this. Over and over, you'll have this. And if you watch for it in Matthew, it becomes something like clockwork. We'll have some ministry, and we have a pull-aside. We'll have some ministry, we have some pull-aside to help them unpack it. So we said we'd see some of these principles, those little gears up in the sky above our chart. And I said all through, this is the most repeated observation on how Jesus makes disciples. So he makes time and space to be accessible. Now, where are we in Matthew's book to kind of put this parable in perspective? We've said Matthew's book breaks down into 5 what we're calling books. Those are chunks of narrative paired with teaching. So we'll have Jesus going around doing some stuff, and then there'll be some teaching that speaks into what we saw in the narrative. And so in that sort of a clustering, we're in book 3. This is the 3rd cluster, and we're in the teaching side of it. That was kind of obvious, right? Because our passage was all teaching. So chapters 11 and 12 of Matthew, he was traveling different places. There was still bits of teaching in there, but he was moving here, healing this guy. He was doing stuff. And now chapter 13, we get just one parable, one teaching after another, after another, after another, and they're addressing the concerns or questions that rose up out of chapters 11 and 12. So chapters 11 and 12, some of the themes we've seen is the response to Jesus' message. Right? Earlier book was the calling of the disciples, and even what is the message. We had the Sermon on the Mount. Now, we often get summary form of his teaching, And we're just watching people reject the gospel of the kingdom. So in chapter 11, we've got whole cities rejecting him. In chapter 12, we've got this back and forth dialogue where the crowds seem to be getting it. Can this not be the Son of David? And the Pharisees are just getting more and more opposed to Jesus. They reject his message. Even to the point where it says they begin plotting how to destroy him. And they're asking questions to trap him. They're not even asking questions because they want to know the answer. They're just trying to see if they can get him to mess up. So we've had this climaxing theme of the rejection of Jesus' message. And so that brought us into chapter 13. 13's teaching is going to look back on this theme. And so 2 weeks ago, when we looked at the first parable in chapter 13, it was the different soils. Good seed goes out to all of them, and it doesn't grow for different reasons. And we looked at how we respond to the word. It was a challenge because it answers part of the question that comes from the narrative. If Jesus is preaching the good news of the kingdom, if he's the long anticipated Messiah, why doesn't everybody just receive it? And he says, well, you have to respond to that message, and how you respond is going to affect what the word does. Same word goes to all, and the seed's good. But if you're going to love other things, it's not going to grow. If you're going to let the cares of the world choke it out, it's not going to grow. If you're going to listen to the resistance of Satan, the evil one, to let him snatch it away because you're hard-hearted, it's not going to grow. And so he gives all these circumstances and says, you need to decide how you're going to respond to the word. So the first parable is answering part of the question. Why the rejection of Jesus? Now we move into another parable. This one, I think, is answering a different question. It's a question that I think you can see in, let's see, there's our parables. There we go. In Luke's gospel, there's a moment where Jesus is going around. He preaches in all the Samaritan cities, and they reject him. And the disciples look at that rejection of Jesus, and they ask in Luke 9:54, Lord, should we call down fire upon the cities? I mean, if you're the Messiah, and you're announcing the kingdom of God is at hand, and they reject it, why don't you do something? And I think that's a similar question that rises out of Matthew's gospel. The Pharisees are plotting to destroy Jesus. They're asking questions that Jesus and the disciples know are just trapping questions. And Jesus just answers them and keeps rolling. And so you got like, okay, on one hand, why are people rejecting it? But the other question is, why don't you deal with the people that reject your message? Why is the Messiah so weak and patient? I think that, so we're more comfortable with the idea that we know Jesus came to suffer and die on a cross. So that's our default expectation. Their expectation was a military ruler, right? You come and you announce it, and then you draw the sword and you make it happen. And so the Messiah says, I'm the one, and everyone's opposing him, and he just takes it. So if the first parable is asking, why doesn't everyone accept the message, then these three parables, I think, are asking the question of, why does God's judgment wait? Why does God's judgment wait? Why does it take long? Why doesn't he just instantly do something? And so we've got three parables that come together to show God's economy, how God is working with the world, and God's timing, if you will. So we get the weeds and the wheat, we get the mustard seed, and we get the leaven and put in the dough. And so that's our flow. I mean, the passage follows that. Verses 24 through 30 is the parable of the weeds. Verses 31 through 32, parable of the mustard seed. Verse 33 all by itself, parable of the leaven. Verses 34 and 35, we get a reinforcement. This isn't new, where he says this is fulfilling prophecy. He cites Psalm 78:2. And so he's saying, don't be surprised. This is how it was said it would go. And then verses 36 through 43, we get Jesus explaining the parable of the weeds. And he basically says, look, the sower is the Son of Man, the field's the world. We've got two kinds of seeds in this parable. One set of seeds is the sons of the kingdom, and the other set of seeds, he initially says, is the sons of the evil one. But later, when they're harvesting him up, he says they're the causes of all evil, and they're the lawbreakers. And so they're people, but they're also not people. And so here's our parable. Now, this parable can be tangly. You can raise some really not fun questions from this parable. I mean, right out the gate, you're going, so wait, if I'm the wrong seed, tough luck? I mean, I thought we just got done. We got this question of why are people rejecting? Is it was part of the point just to say, well, some people are going to reject. They can't help it. I met somebody who that was their take. They're like, well, no, I think, it's probably all true. I just don't think I'm one of the ones who gets to respond. So, tough. Is that where this parable's going? I'm going to say no. Why? I mean, because you could twist it that way. Let me teach you a couple things on how to interpret a parable. And this will help you. It'll ruin some sermons for you, but it'll help you. When we make illustrations in speaking, our illustrations are true in regard to what we were trying to say. And they're not necessarily true about anything else. So like, if I'm in a business setting and I want to talk about how our sales have been going, and I have a chart for this, and I make a chart and a graph, and it's got all its different bars showing the sales levels. Let me see there we go, my chart and my graph. And I'm saying, so we had this many sales of this toys and this many sales of that toys, and you're like, cool, that graph is an illustration, right, to show our sales. And then one of the guys in the group says, I noticed you colored the one set of toys red. I would like to point out that Tim is an idiot. The toys are not red. That wasn't, just because I made it red doesn't mean, you can't just make my illustration mean anything you want. It has a meaning, and in the intended meaning, you're welcome to ask. Since I'm trying to tell you numbers of sales, you are totally welcome to say, it looks like the one bar is a lot bigger than the other. Does that mean we sold a lot more? Yes, good question. You're tracking. So, illustrations generally are true in the point they wanted to make, and it's usually one point. And outside of that, you just need to leave them alone. And I use that with illustrations in a setting where you're like, well, duh. But parables are illustrations. They're elaborate illustrations, but that's what they are. And so with a parable, you have to ask, what's the point of the parable? And then the parable is generally true regarding that point only. I'll give you one more example of a parable. When I went on those mission trips I mentioned in my intro, the leader of the mission trip used to like to give an example, and it was about encouraging people. And he would tell this story about these elves that had warm fuzzies, these little fuzzy balls they carried around. And they used to give their warm fuzzies away generously, and everyone was happy. And then there was this one angry, bitter elf, and he said, if you give your warm fuzzies away, you'll not have any. And so then everybody began to hoard their warm fuzzies, and everyone was sad, and there was no more giving warm fuzzies. It was a kind of dumb parable. But the point was you should encourage each other, and it works better if we all encourage each other, all right? If I walked out and was like, oh my word, my director believes in elves. Nobody thought he believes in elves or magical warm fuzzies. If I took away, it's like, okay, I got to go find me some fuzzy objects to start giving away. He also would have been disappointed. He's like, no, don't give literal fuzzies away. Write encouraging notes. Say kind things to each other, It was true in the sense it was intended. And as soon as you start pulling at other places, stuff gets weird. That's going to be true in our parable. So when we look at this story, you have to go, or take one from our text, right? Let's put the weeds aside for a second. Parable of the mustard seed. Jesus' intended meaning is to look at the small size and the huge results. And you can pull lots of things from that, and that's fair game. Anything dealing with that intended meaning is going to help. It's not okay to wonder if the kingdom of heaven is circular or oval. I mean, I don't even know what shape a mustard seed is, really. And it's definitely not on point to wonder if the kingdom of heaven, goes good with ketchup and on a burger. That would not be the point of it, even though he said mustard. So, with the main parable here, the parable of the weeds, does it teach determinism? Is the point of this parable to say, some people just going to be haters, haters going to hate? The conflict in it, I mean, they do ask, where does seed come from? And he says, evil one sowed it. And they're like, cool. That's not the conflict, because nobody struggles with that, and it doesn't develop at all in the story. But then he's going, what should we do about the fact that there's evil and good mixed together? And that's where the story hangs out. Well, we'll go harvest them. He's like, no, don't harvest them. If you harvest them now, you're going to pull up some of the good weed. You're going to have to wait till the harvest. And so then the resolution of the story is about the harvesting. They will ultimately have to be harvested and separated out. But that'll be at the end of the age. So the story, that's why I say it's focused on God's judgment delaying. The problem is we've got good and evil all mixed together in our world. Why does a good God allow a world to still have evil in it? Why doesn't he just get that out of here? That's the conflict. And so this story is illustrating that struggle, which is a struggle we deal with. And it does make sense in chapters 11 and 12. Why doesn't Jesus just get rid of the people and the issues that are opposing his messiahship? I mean, he's walking in a broken world, and the brokenness is making a mess of his announcement of the kingdom. Why not right away? Why doesn't he get rid of the bad seed? So the point of the parable is that God's judgment, this is his point, with this, he delays out of compassion. Well, if we tore up the bad seed now, some of the good seed would get uprooted too. And I don't want to do that. So out of compassion, to not rip up any of the good seed, we'll wait. We'll wait and let this mess go on. Everyone's upset about it in the parable, so they're acknowledging this is not a good situation. But compassion to not uproot any of the good seed, to let it bear fruit and make sure we get the right ones, says we wait. So the point of parable is that God's judgment delays because of God's compassion for his children. And I think when you see the parable that way, you can see how the second two parables sort of reinforce that. Because both of them have this thing where, like, you have surprised results. If you judged prematurely, you'd be wrong, right? Mustard seed. Who cares about that, right? And you say, oh, don't judge it. Plant it and wait. I know right now it looks like nothing, but give it time. If you judge it now, you'll miss the point. 11, the whole thing kind of happens invisibly. But you walk away and you come back and there's a whole bunch more dough in the bowl. What happened? This idea of prematurely, of early judgment being wrong, is the consistent thread between the three parables. And so we read them together that way. A small seed that grows into an impressive plant. Leaven that spreads through a whole lump of dough invisibly when given time. They give the sense of not judging things prematurely. You might be surprised who comes around to the kingdom. Just like the early wheat and the weeds might look similar and their baby roots can get pulled up together, if God judged the world early, many who would have come into the kingdom won't get to. So let the seeds grow. Let the leaven spread for now. And then when you open up the bowl of dough, there'll be a lot more there. And so this is especially true when you take this question they're struggling with and you zoom it out a little bit. I mean, if God should not delay his judgment, then how early should God have acted? Because anything after Adam is delay. If God didn't delay judgment, none of us would have been born. You don't even got a shot at salvation. You don't get a shot at breath. And so that's where you realize, okay, well, yeah, the absolute answer is he has to delay. If we're all here at all, he delayed. But so then you say, okay, well, we can moderate. Don't have to take it to that extreme, right? Couldn't God just judge the absolute worst and leave the rest of us here graciously to sort it out? In one, I would just say, well, I mean, how do you know he didn't? We only got the world you have. I can imagine worse worlds, and I don't know what he stopped. But more than that, I think Scripture answers that. Look to Noah. If you take all the nasty people of the earth away and you keep only the most righteous man on the planet, we don't even kick sin back a generation. He gets off the ark, gets drunk, and curses his kid. If we don't have absolute judgment, we don't fix the problem. If your concern is, why does God let evil keep existing? Look, either he lets evil keep existing, graciously giving us time to repent, or he needs to get rid of me. You have to see it that way. Either he gets rid of me and you and everybody else, it's got to be total, or it doesn't fix the problem. That's the answer of Scripture. And that's really the answer to the parable. We can't just go in here and try and root them through and do a half measure. We got to get them all out, and so we're going to wait to the end, and we're going to get them all out. Noah.
Something I just want to point out is I feel like another reason he also does it is because it also contradicts his choice of giving us free will.
Yeah, well, one of the points I would make, if you want to read this parable to say, hey, you just don't got any choice, seed jar is a seed jar, you have to go, that's really weird, because the very preceding parable was about our response to the word. And I don't think Jesus contradicts himself that quick. I don't think he contradicts himself at all, but if he was going to do it, nobody contradicts himself that badly, right? This is politician level. So no, he just said, it matters how you respond. He's not going to say the next parable and say, actually, it doesn't matter how you respond. Tough luck, bud, right? So no, and so he's coming in here and he's saying, no, I'm actually going to give you space to grow. And so that's the heart of this parable, is it says, in the face of the concern, fully acknowledging the brokenness in the world, fully acknowledging the world is not the way God wants it to be. He's not pleased. He planted a better field. And it's broken and it's a mess because of the evil one. And yet God says, we'll wait. We'll wait. So put these three parables together. I might have had more. That was the mustard seed reference about ketchup. I'm late on my slides. See if it'll go. Why is God's judgment? Wait. Here's what the parables are saying. Ultimately, God delays his judgment out of his wisdom and mercy. He gives time for all who would come. Why does a good God allow evil and suffering to remain in the world? Because if he removed all the evil in the world right away, no one would be left. You and I wouldn't have been born. And at the same time, these parables affirm that total judgment will come. Anything less than total judgment leaves the world broken by evil. And so God gives us the gift of time by means of great anguish, because with time comes suffering in a broken world. And so, in a little bit after our message, we're going to take communion. We do this, in the words of Paul, declaring his death until he comes. So he will return and he will judge. That can't be escaped. We have to deal with that, and it has to be total. We sit in the time that has been given by grace. It's a costly, limited gift. So don't waste it. So what do we do with a passage like this? This picture, why does he warn of the time? Why does he tell us? That's the program. Let me give you at least 3 thoughts I have on how I think this speaks to us, and I'm praying God's Spirit will give you more. But one, let the brokenness in the world, let me see, yeah. Let the brokenness in the world motivate your witness. If he's given us time so the plants can grow, so that all who would come can, and we're still waiting in a broken world. When you see the broken world, that's a reminder that there's still time for people around you to come to Jesus. There's still time for you to have a conversation with somebody. And so when you see the brokenness, when you see all that's not yet and not working and not as it should be in our world, remember that this is God's mercy, and you need to ask, who around me might still need to come to Jesus? God is forbearing that it bothers him too. And he's enduring that so that they have more time. That should motivate you. Rather than getting frustrated and defeated by the brokenness of the world, let it motivate you to say, I've been given time. 2, let me make observations from some of the other 2 parables. We got the mustard seed, right? It's not so much that the mustard seed becomes a huge tree as much as it becomes a dense bush that can shelter all manner of animals and other plants. I mean, it's crazy. This little seed basically creates an entire ecosystem. And so that's verse 32. It says the birds come and make nests in it. So some of the surprise of the kingdom is that these things, if you prejudge them, you'd be surprised what comes out. But then what comes out? What's his heart? What do we do? He's given us time to bloom. And what he wants us to bloom into is to be refuges in this broken world. You're supposed to be a refuge. That's part of the subtle strategy of the kingdom in waiting. Instead of asking, why is God still letting so much evil run loose in the world? Maybe it's time we ask, why are we letting so much evil run loose in our homes? Peter says judgment begins in the household of God, 1 Peter 4:17. It's easy to complain about the wickedness and the brokenness out there. But while the Lord tarries, he's put you here to be his witnesses. Make your homes, make your lives, make your very presence a place of peace in a world at war. He's given you time to bloom. He's given time for that seed to grow. And that's going to be part of the work of the kingdom here. As we see the wheat actually grow up and bear its fruit, and it becomes something life-giving in this broken world. And that's going to be a contrast that draws people in. So if he's given you time, don't sit around being defeatist and, I'm just so broken. No, he's given you time because he wants you to flourish here as a witness to his kingdom. Bloom. Become that bush. I hope that your non-believing friends say, I don't even get it. But when I hang out with you, I'm more at peace. I get some rest when I come to your house, when I call you up and talk. That we start being these mustard seeds that grow into these bushes that harbor the birds, so that in the time we're given, more people might hear and experience and come into the kingdom. Let me give you a third takeaway. We've got the leaven, right? God's kingdom spreads in subtle ways over time. I think that's the point of the leaven. Why do you want to not judge it prematurely? Because you can't see all the ways it's working. Right? We tend towards a flash in the pan sort of faith. And that's why we wonder, why is he waiting? Just blow something up. That's literally the disciples' question. You want to call down fire? So we want shock and awe. We want explosions. But what Jesus says in answer to that, rather than going, okay, because he can blow stuff up. He says that sometimes people get into the kingdom slowly and quietly, like a lump of dough set aside with a little bit of leaven in it. I've shared before, one of the first times I got to pray with someone to accept Christ, it was a really anticlimactic conversion story. I knew this kid didn't know Jesus. He came to me as I was his counselor at camp, and it was just day one, could tell, doesn't know a thing about Jesus. And so we're having Bible studies, and I'm just hoping he'd ask questions. I'm looking for that, movie moment where we have the deep heart-to-heart, and I win this kid to Jesus. And we just had really good devotionals every day as a team. The other kids who were Christians all jumped in and had a blast, and he just kind of listened on the side. And I didn't get any read from his face that anything was happening. And I was burdened for this kid. And I remember even staying after at firesides to pray for him, just going like, something's got to happen. And the last day of camp, he just walks up to me. And he says, I've been listening to you guys in all the Bible studies and the way you talk about God and the way you have a relationship with him. And I want that. Caught me totally flat-footed because there was nothing blew up. It was just matter of fact. And so then I'm like stammering, trying to like figure out how to get back on script. And so I'm like, but sin separates us from the relationship. So we need to be forgiven. He's like, yeah, I understand. I'm a sinner. Christ died for my sins. I need to be forgiven. And I want that. He's like way out ahead of me. And I'm sitting there like, so I remember I'm like trying to get, okay, so he gets sin, he gets forgiveness, he gets the cross. And so I was just like, well, I think you should tell him. And he says, okay. I said, do you want me to lead you in a prayer? He says, no, I think I got it. And he kneels down and he just confesses his sins and asks Jesus to save him right there on the spot. And I'm sitting there going like, what just happened? Slowly, quietly, invisibly, the leaven of the gospel sitting in a bunch of other campers and his counselor just got into him and was getting in there and spreading and multiplying, and it finally arrived at critical mass, and he just came into the kingdom. And the most overwhelming thing to me was how underwhelming my role was. I was just a bystander as God got somebody saved. It just oozed out and he saved him. And I remember being struck by that because we want the story where I said the thing and he was moved with conviction, he tore his clothes and wept. And God does that. There's scriptures for that. But then there's also this where Jesus looks at a bunch of people resisting and says, don't prejudge this. You don't know how many people in that crowd that looks like they're all rejecting me are quietly listening. And the gospel's soaking in. And it's like that dough that looks like it's just a little bit of leaven in there. And it was just a little bit of leaven. And then surprise, it's everywhere. It got the whole lump. And so he puts this picture of this is one of the ways the gospel spreads. Jesus says sometimes people get brought into the kingdom slowly and quietly, like a lump of dough set aside with a little leaven in it. Are you up for leaven-style faith? You know, the kind that grows through consistency over time, through quiet devotion to Him, to His body, the church, and to His gospel. Who are those people you've just been tempted to give up on because they know you, they know about your faith, you've said the things you knew to say, and they are still rejecting Him? Don't give up. They're not out of reach of the kingdom. That's what this parable says. Don't discount that and don't give up. Don't stop. Maybe it's your spiritual disciplines, or maybe it's our church. You struggle with the idea of just a quiet consistency. You know, you've got a magic number in your head you think we need to reach before you'll be satisfied. And then our church, is cool. Or you've got a little timer waiting, and if something really cool and exciting doesn't happen here before a certain amount of time, you'll call it. But look around you. Are people growing? I'm not saying numerically. Are people becoming more like Jesus? Because I know from where I sit, I could almost go name by name and tell you different areas where I see people becoming more like Jesus. It's quiet, subtle stuff. It's becoming more open to counsel when you used to be more rash. It's people starting to have accountability. It's people learning to study God's Word better than they did before. People who have begun to actually share their faith a little bit when they never did that prior. It's quiet, it's subtle, but it's also one of the ways the kingdom spreads. And so I can say with confidence, yes. So the question for you would be, can you let the kingdom have time? God does. And it's harder for Him than it is for you. He sees the suffering and the brokenness more. And can we do the quiet, repetitive, sincere things of loving and following Jesus without the fireworks? What would that look like for you in your life? So this is our point. God delays His judgment to graciously give us time to come to Jesus and to reach the world for Him. Let that motivate you to reach the lost, to grow into a clearer witness and live faithfully in the time that you've been given. So here's the questions I want us to chew on then as we move into our small groups. 1, what are some of those quiet and unflashy disciplines that help shape you more like Jesus over time? Maybe you've seen some bear some fruit in your own life. I think we need to make sure we talk about and embrace that stuff. 2, how can our group help each other keep from giving up on the slow-moving and long-running issues and needs in our lives? You know, the beautiful picture here is the waiting actually did bear fruit. And there was a harvest, and there was a mustard bush, and there was a lot more dough when we came back. I think so often we just quit too soon. We didn't get the big thing, and we relate to the disciples. We're like, just blow something up, I'm done. How do we help each other hang in there till the harvest? So those are our questions. I'm going to let you break into groups, and I'm going to let the kiddos come with me. We're going to head to the back and look at a Bible story and talk about our catechism a little bit. And I think that Joel is going to be reading us our Bible story today. So head to your different groups, and we'll be back in a little bit.